I'm Liz Faublas, and this is Currents. It's one of the church's most important fights. We'll have the latest on the Fortnight for Freedom.
Well, religious freedom is certainly one of the pillars of our country. From the very beginning of our country, our Constitution has been guaranteeing freedom of religion.
Plus, how faith and freedom are indivisible. And he could be the deciding opinion on the Supreme Court's healthcare reform decision. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. Fortnight for Freedom events continue across the country on day 6 of the 2-week period of prayer and action. Los Angeles Archbishop Jose Gomez spoke about the fortnight during Sunday Mass at Our Lady of the Angels Cathedral in Los Angeles. He told those gathered that the church is concerned that the country is, quote, losing its will to promote and defend our most basic freedoms, the freedom of religion and the freedom of conscience. Gomez says the greatest threat to freedom of religion does not come from the government, but from our own lack of faith and courage. He also made clear the purpose of the Fortnight for Freedom.
And I think it is important for all of us as we reflect on our celebration today, that this fortnight is not about politics. It's about God and our relationship with God. It's about our freedom to do what our faith in Jesus Christ requires.
And events are taking place here in the Diocese of Brooklyn throughout the fortnight, including Tuesday night at Our Lady of Angels Church in Bay Ridge.
Here at Our Lady of Angels Church in the Bay Ridge section of Brooklyn, tonight we're having 2 guest speakers from the diocese going to be talking about voter registration and the whole sense of freedom, rights.
Our conscience is being attacked. Our religious freedom is under attack. Someone once will come and say, you can't go to Mass, or you can't exercise your right to be free, to believe in whatever you want to believe.
Well, religious freedom is certainly one of the pillars of our country. From the very beginning of our country, our Constitution has been guaranteeing freedom of religion.
Prayer is an important thing. It's a powerful thing. It's what makes us Catholics as a whole. But we need to do more than just pray. We cannot hope that they're going to do the right thing and act the right way. We need to be active.
The church is on very, very dangerous grounds now, because it most likely will not stop with what Obama is proposing now.
What brought me here is fear of what is going to happen if we don't act now.
If they're forcing you to provide contraception and provide sterilization, I mean, that's pretty 1984-ish with George Orwell.
A few years ago in New York State, they started to tell us that you had to provide contraception, abortion services. And the option was, no, you don't have to if you became self-insured. But now we're being faced with another situation. It doesn't matter what we do. We are being told you have to do this. We don't care that you don't believe in it. We don't care it. We are saying this is the law.
We need to make sure that the First Amendment right to freedom of religion is maintained in this government, and if it's presently under attack, we as Catholics must inform our elected officials in Washington, in Albany, and here in New York that that's something that just can't happen.
In our society today, what is inconvenient is simply disposable, and that we have gotten actually completely away from what the sanctity of life, and actually what was most important in this country. Now what's inconvenient is disposable, and that includes unborn children.
As a Roman Catholic, I cannot inform people about abortions. I cannot inform people that it's an option. I have to. It's no, because life is precious from birth until natural death.
Over here, we have a democratic, society, which is turning not to be so democratic because they're trying to tell people what to believe or not.
I'm also concerned about the slippery slope, where it starts with one right and then goes down the slippery slope to where it includes other freedoms, and before you know it, your freedoms, total freedoms, are taken away.
The church is really responding in a very positive way to help educate its members so we can then speak among each other and feel like we're a family again.
The National Catholic Bioethics Center and the National Catholic Partnership for the Disabled has compiled a list of recommended activities for the Fortnight for Freedom. Among the suggestions, exercising your freedom of religious speech by participating in a vigil outside an abortion clinic. There is more currents ahead. The Supreme Court decision on health care is not the only talk of the town in Washington. We'll have more from the nation's capital along with the rest of the day's headlines next. Welcome back to Currents. I'm Liz Faublas. 10 U.S. senators joined forces challenging a court's decision to strike down the Defense of Marriage Act in February. The senators filed a so-called friend of the court brief defending DOMA's constitutionality. They argue the court failed to understand how federal law defines marriage and express concerns about state redefinition of marriage. DOMA limits federal marriage to the union of a man and a woman. However, it also says that states are allowed but not required to recognize same-sex marriages entered into in other states. The bill passed both houses of Congress with the support of more than 80% in 1996 before being signed into law by President Bill Clinton. A new survey shows most Americans have favorable views toward immigrants in the U.S. The survey from Knights of Columbus and Marist found most Americans, 83%, have a respectful view of immigrants. Not only that, but they would support long-term measures to make legal residence possible. 74% of Americans would back legal residence for illegal immigrants, provided they paid a fine, learned English, and had a job that would pay taxes. Now, only 17% held a negative opinion about immigrants' motives for coming to the U.S. There were signs of concern, though. 76% of U.S. adults are worried about the effect of immigration on the country's healthcare system. Carl Anderson, leader of the Knights of Columbus, thinks the survey, quote, has potential to recast our national debate if this nonpartisan solution is embraced. Well, the Pope is getting ready for some time away from Vatican City. Rome Reports has more on that.
The Pope celebrated the last general audience of the summer. At the end of this week, he'll head out to his summer residence of Castel Gandolfo to start off his summer vacation. With roughly 7,000 people in attendance, the Pope talked about St. Paul's letter to the Philippians by focusing on the human condition and the divinity of Jesus.
As Jesus' exaltation took place through his abasement, so in our lives and our prayer, we discover that by lowering ourselves in humility and love, we are lifted up to God.
The Pope said that true Christianity is more than following the example of Jesus. It's also about living and acting as he would.
May we more frequently bend the knee in praise and worship of Christ's divinity and his lordship over all creation. In our prayer, may we be ever more faithful witnesses of his sovereignty in our every thought, word, and deed.
The Pope then encouraged the youth to take advantage of the summer. In addition to relaxing, he said they should also take part in social projects to care for the needy.
All Egyptians, including Christians, will be protected by the incoming administration. That message from Egypt's president-elect during a meeting with Catholic leaders. Mohamed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood candidate, told the leaders that he will do his best to protect all citizens, including Christians. The meeting took place a day after Morsi met with the interim leader of Egypt's Coptic Church. Copts make up the vast majority of the 8 million Christians in Egypt. Elsewhere, a historic meeting in Northern Ireland with two leaders once on opposite sides of the religious divide. On Wednesday, Queen Elizabeth shook hands with former Irish Republican Army Commander Martin McGuinness. He's the second person seen here in a line of officials. McGuinness, who now serves as Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, says he spoke to the Queen in Irish. Translating, he said he wished her goodbye and Godspeed. The Queen smiled but did not speak. The handshake came 14 years after the end of deadly conflict between the largely Catholic pro-Irish forces and mostly Protestant pro-British forces in Northern Ireland. Around 3,500 people, including a cousin of Queen Elizabeth, were killed in violence that lasted 3 decades. An international human rights group has started a fund to fight China's policy of forced abortions. Catholic News Agency reports that the nonprofit China Aid Association has launched the Chinese Children Defense Fund. The money raised will help pay for lawyers for families who face forced abortions for violating China's one-child per family policy. The money will also help pay fines for families to avoid having forced abortions. On its website, the Chinese Aid Association chronicles the story of one woman who was forced to have an abortion in her 7th month of pregnancy. She and her husband were expecting their second child and could not afford to pay the fine. Well, it's an issue that came up last year in California. Now, a German court has ruled that circumcising young boys on religious grounds amounts to bodily harm. According to a German news agency, a court in Cologne ruled that a child's right to physical integrity outweighs freedom of religion and the rights of the parents. The case involved a doctor who circumcised a 4-year-old boy who suffered complications following that procedure. Last year, California Governor Jerry Brown signed a measure into law that prohibited local governments in the state from banning circumcision. That measure came in response to efforts to ban circumcision in San Francisco. The proposed ban was roundly criticized by religious leaders, including the Archbishop of San Francisco. Well, looking for a few good women, a vocations director in Canada is taking to social media in search of recruits. Reporter Briar Stewart has that.
For Sister Elaine Lachance, this is part of her life's work. For the past 5 decades, she's been a member of the Good Shepherd Sisters of Quebec.
Because I used to say, oh, there's more to life than dancing and parties and having fun.
For years, she's helped counsel women. Now she has another mission. For that, she's not only turning to God, but she's also going online.
At first, it was very scary for me to even think about going with social media. But I went with it, and I'm very grateful. That's where the young people are, especially on Facebook.
Lachance is fiercely trying to recruit new nuns because across the country, the sisters are aging. In Canada, the vast majority of nuns are over the age of 75, and young women aren't lining up to fill their shoes. In fact, across the entire country, there are just 84 nuns under the age of 35.
Oh, lots of memories.
In Edmonton, the sisters are packing up. For nearly 90 years, Rosary Hall has been a home to women living with mental illness, but there are no longer enough nuns to run this facility.
Last week was really hard because all of a sudden there's echoes here.
The women have moved out, and sisters like Pat Amio are moving on.
Women can do anything they want now. And in the past, we were more limited.
It's a hard life.
This theology professor says while it's hard to sell women today on a life of poverty and chastity, nuns played an integral part in Canada's development.
A lot of the heavy lifting was done by religious sisters, not just schools and hospitals, but missionary work, isolated places, and that's an enormous cultural legacy.
One that Sister Lachance is hoping to extend, a hard task, even with Facebook, considering her order has only had 3 new Canadian members during the past 20 years.
And that report from Briar Stewart. Stay tuned, there's more currents ahead. Coming up, an author tells us why it's important to speak now for religious liberty. It has now been 1 week since the start of the Fortnight for Freedom campaign. The 2-week period of prayer and activism emerged as a protest against the Obama administration's Health and Human Services mandate. The rule requires most religious organizations, regardless of their beliefs, to cover contraception, sterilization, and abortion-inducing drugs for women free of charge in their health plans. Dioceses across the nation have organized masses, parish events, voter registration drives, and seminars. It's all intended to give Catholics in solidarity with bishops the opportunity to help restore religious freedom and conscience protections. But how much do we really consider what life would be like if we were denied any of these basic rights? That's just one of the questions I posed to author Jay Richards. Earlier today, we discussed the themes of his book, Indivisible: Restoring Faith, Family, and Freedom Before It's Too Late. It served as a timely backdrop for our talk about the Fortnight for Freedom. Jay, your book, Indivisible: Restoring Faith, Family, and Freedom Before It's Too Late, kind of a perfect prequel to the Fortnight for Freedom, because you and I talked about the book and its message at length not too long ago. Now we're seeing this tremendous national effort on the part of U.S. bishops. What are your thoughts about the Fortnight?
Well, it's certainly, strangely, I feel like it's providential. In our book, Indivisible, we argue that both the economic and the so-called social issues are important. And if you remember, in 2011, we were told that nobody's going to want to talk about religious liberty or life or marriage, and yet those are the issues that everyone's focusing on. It's above the fold every day, almost in the New York Times. And I feel like as Catholics, we should, think of this as an opportunity, honestly, because it's a rare thing when all the American bishops are in perfect unanimity on an issue like this. And I think it's an opportunity for us to stand together. And it's especially good news because evangelicals and Protestants and even just sort of liberty-loving Americans are rallied around this. And so I think that's a very unusual circumstance when we have that broad of a coalition coming together around an issue of such importance like religious freedom.
Jay, in terms of keeping this topical, with regard to the Obamacare mandate, that's the talk lately and has been for quite some time. You have said in the last century, our laws fail to recognize the intrinsic rights endowed by our Creator for some classes of human beings. And rather than avoiding the laws that prohibit the free exercise of religion, Congress is now trying to compel religious citizens to act in ways that violate their deepest moral belief. Now, this has been, in your words, about 100 years in the making. How do we begin to change this thought process?
Well, I think it's already changing. I mean, if you look at the opinions of young people, for instance, on the pro-life issue, young people tend to be more pro-life than their elders, even though they're getting sort of squishy on questions like marriage. And so I think we have to remember it took 100 years for us to get into this position, and so we're not going to solve the problem in one election. And so I like to say that we're concerned about not just this election, but the direction of our country, and we need to start helping our fellow Americans think clearly about these issues. I don't want to imply that the election 2012 is not important. These are very important things, but it's not going to be a quick fix, because we've got to get people thinking about the foundations of freedom, about that first thing in the Declaration of Independence, life. Life is the first freedom, and without that, you can't have liberty in the pursuit of happiness. And so I really think this is going to take both a kind of spiritual awakening on part of the American public, but also an intellectual and a cultural change in which we see the connection between our contempt for life and the effects it has on our culture as a whole.
Jay, we talked a little bit before the interview began about tomorrow's potential decision on the Obamacare mandate coming down from the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court decides not to strike down any part of Obamacare and that health care law, what are you prepared to do to get the word out about the implications of that decision?
Well, I'm going to keep doing certainly what I'm doing now, and I think however it goes, the fight is not over. I'm optimistic that the court is at least going to strike down the individual mandate. We don't know that for sure. But the truth of the matter is, if you look at polls, the majority of Americans do not like Obamacare and actually think it needs to be overturned. I really think it would help a lot if the Supreme Court struck down the most egregious part of that bill. But in either case, we still have a long, hard fight, because it's not just the individual mandate that we need to fight, it's the bill as a whole. It's actually going to make the problems with things like health care costs worse rather than better. And so I'm going to continue to speak on that subject, whatever happens tomorrow morning.
Jay, are you confident that it's possible we can have a world with enough Christians willing to fight issues that contradict their faith?
I am. I mean, just think of the first century. I mean, you have the Roman Empire, which is a massive pagan empire, the most powerful political entity in history up until that time. A small minority of Christians that were persecuted on and off, actually murdered, and yet that small band of Christians, over a course of about 3 centuries, not only prevailed, but transformed the Roman Empire from the inside. And so my question is, look, if there's, let's say 86% of the public self-identify as Christians. Let's cut that in half and say it's 40 or 45%. that it could actually be active. That's a huge percentage of the population, and so if we're not affecting the culture, I think part of the problem is with us, and we need to do a little bit of introspection. Because if the early church could transform the Roman Empire, my question is, what are we doing wrong that we're not doing, and what do we need to do to turn this thing around?
Jay, what triggered your writing of the book? Like, why was it so important for you to write the book now? And I should also mention that there's also a website version as well. Why now?
Well, I mean, honestly, my co-author and I both feel that we're at a momentous time in our history. I mean, we've got both serious economic concerns with an unbelievable and unsustainable amount of debt expenditures, certainly at the federal level, but also these key moral issues. I mean, we have things that no one debated previously in history in the political sphere, things like the very definition of marriage, very definition of what a human being is. Those things are up for grab now, and so we've got these fundamental philosophical and moral issues and serious economic issues that are all converging on this one moment. And so that can either be perilous, and it is perilous, but it can also be an opportunity for us to repent as a nation and as a church.
Stay tuned. There's more Currents ahead. As we await the Supreme Court's decision on healthcare laws, some say one justice's opinion may decide the case. As the Fortnight for Freedom enters its second week, the fate of the law at the heart of the religious liberty fight rests in the hands of the Supreme Court. The country's highest court will issue its ruling on the Affordable Care Act on Thursday, and it could go one of three ways. The court may decide that the law, as it now stands, is constitutional. The court could instead rule that either all or part of the law is unconstitutional. And some say the decision may come down to the opinion of one justice, and the one who has the second longest tenure of the 9 current justices. Anthony Kennedy is one of 6 Catholic justices currently serving on the High Court. Kennedy was appointed by President Reagan in November 1987 and approved by the Senate in February of '88. And he may turn out to be the swing vote on the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. CNN's Joe Johns has more on that.
He's the man in the middle, the right-leaning justice who often swings left on some of the most hot-button cases: the death penalty, abortion, immigration. Now, the Sacramento native might be the one Time magazine calls the decider, whose vote in Thursday's healthcare ruling could make all the difference.
In any 9-member court that's closely divided, someone's going to be in the middle. And for us, that's Justice Kennedy, who's a solid conservative, but does vote with the left in a material number of cases. And when it comes to healthcare, there's every reason to think that he'll be right there in the center as well.
The 75-year-old Kennedy asked tough questions of both sides during the March oral arguments over the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act and the key funding provision, the so-called individual mandate, which would require most Americans to purchase health insurance or pay a penalty. The justice wondered whether Congress went too far.
The government is saying that the federal government has a duty to tell the individual citizen that it must act, and that is different from what we have in previous cases. Well, that changes the relationship of the federal government to the individual in a very fundamental way.
But some sympathy, too, for the Obama administration and the unique aspects of health care in the national economy, suggesting perhaps the health insurance market was special enough that he could vote to uphold the mandate.
This is a question about states' rights, which he cares a lot about. It's a question about individual liberty and the relationship between the government and the American public, which he cares a lot about. And so it would be quite surprising if he weren't in the majority in the end. We don't know on which of the questions the court's going to divide 5-4, but if it does, then he's likely to be the pivotal vote.
Such influence makes Kennedy a target from the left and the right. Critics say he lacks an overarching judicial philosophy, and his case-by-case approach has earned him nicknames: Flipper and the Errant Voyager. Kennedy comes from a family of lawyers, a federal judge for 37 years, the last quarter century on the High Court. Friends say he is a curious, civic-minded intellectual with a taste for Shakespeare and his beloved San Francisco Giants.
And that report from CNN's Joe Johns. And be sure to join us on Thursday night when we talk with the Becket Fund about the Supreme Court's decision. Until then, you can visit us online at currentsny.net. You can also connect with us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. For all of us here at Currents, I'm Liz Faublas. We leave you tonight with scenes from Pope Benedict's summer residence, Castel Gandolfo, where he will travel at the end of the week. Thank you for watching and have a good night.